illegal aliens from serving as sponsors. I think that's a key component to protect the children themselves. UACs should not be placed in a home of a person with no immigration permanence in this country where their caregiver may be deported at any moment. That is not a stable environment for a child to live or to thrive. The Democrats say that this bill will cause family separation. This reform ends the perverse incentive that encourages illegal alien parents to have their children smuggled across the border. That practice is happening right now, has been happening for years, particularly under the last administration. We should not be complicit in the smuggling of children into this country. No more. In the last administration, UACs were placed with sponsors before required background checks were even finalized. Mr. Speaker, that's kind of the point, right? That if you're a UAC, that we're not going to place.
So this is what they do now, and this is why you need to listen, because we're about to expose the machinery of manufactured moral panic and the deliberate weaponization of children's safety to advance a dehumanizing agenda against migrants that would make Stephen Miller himself giddy with satisfaction, except he already is given that Russell Fry of South Carolina just pushed through the House the Kayla Hamilton Act, a bill wrapped in the tragic murder of a young woman to justify surveillance state expansion, targeting vulnerable families. And before you even ask whether we should enhance vetting, I want you to understand what's actually happening here, because it's breathtaking in its cynicism, and I'm going to walk you through the layers of deliberate manipulation happening in that clip you just watched. So buckle up, because this gets dark fast. First off, let's talk about the manufactured crisis at the heart of Republican immigration theatrics, which is this notion that Democrats are somehow complicit in child smuggling and trafficking, because the current unaccompanied alien children sponsor system doesn't sufficiently vet adults receiving these kids. But here's what they won't tell you, and here's the bombshell that should make your blood boil. In October, before the Trump administration's apparent moratorium on releasing children to sponsors, the Office of Refugee Resettlement was releasing about 4 kids per day to sponsors. But over the last month and a half, they've released only 4 kids total, which means right now as we speak, the Trump administration is effectively detaining thousands of children in federal custody indefinitely, even when those sponsors have passed enhanced vetting requirements, and nobody can explain why. Think about that for a second, because this is the real story that should be dominating headlines, but instead we're watching Russell Fry on the House floor, deploying emotionally weaponized rhetoric about smuggling and perverse incentives, and claiming Democrats want children placed with sex offenders, which is such a grotesque distortion of reality that it requires us to understand the entire historical context of how we got here, and you're going to want to remember this because it contextualizes everything. The Trump administration's family separation policy from 2017 to 2018 aimed at deterring illegal immigration by separating migrant children from their parents or guardians, and under that policy, federal authorities separated children and infants from parents or guardians, and the adults were prosecuted and held in federal jails or deported, while children were placed under the supervision of the Department of Health and Human Services. And here's the kicker that reveals the intentional cruelty at the heart of this whole enterprise. By early June 2018, the policy did not include measures to reunite families that it had separated, and Scott Lloyd, director of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, had directed his staff not to maintain a list of children who had been separated from their parents, while Matthew Albence, head of enforcement and removal operations for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, told his colleagues to prevent reunification even after parents had been processed, saying that reunification undermines the entire effort, which means the cruelty was the point, and separation was designed as a deterrent mechanism to terrorize families fleeing violence. Now fast forward to the current moment, and we need to talk about what's really happening with the Kayla Hamilton Act, because yes, there was a tragic murder, and yes, that murder was committed by someone who entered as an unaccompanied minor, who was an MS-13 gang member, and that is horrific and should never have happened, but let's be absolutely clear about what Republicans are doing with that tragedy. The Kayla Hamilton Act places greater scrutiny on potential sponsors, requiring DHS to look into criminal histories and immigration status of all adults in a potential sponsor household, and HHS would be prevented from placing a child in a household where adults have criminal histories or are in the country illegally, and any unaccompanied minors over 13 with a history of gang-related arrests or criminal history, or with gang markings or tattoos, would be placed in a secure facility, which sounds reasonable until you understand what this actually means in practice, which is that the February 23 IC memo requires vetting for all adult members of a sponsor household, and the use of DNA testing to establish family ties with non-blood relative sponsors as a particular focus, And while non-blood relative sponsors could be seen as more likely to exploit or mistreat UACs, the vast majority do not, and if categorically eliminating them from the sponsor pool is the goal that will create a shortage of prospective sponsors and leave UACs who lack in-country blood relatives with few options. Here's what makes this so insidious, and why you need to understand the Foucauldian mechanics of surveillance and control being deployed here, because this isn't about protecting children. This is about using the specter of child endangerment to justify a massive expansion of state surveillance and detention of migrant communities. On March 25, 2025, the Office of Refugee Resettlement posted to the Federal Register an interim final rule reversing a 2024 Biden rule that prevented ORR from releasing immigration information about sponsors of unaccompanied minors to any law enforcement or immigration enforcement entity at any time. And under this rule, it is now possible for ORR to provide such information to law and immigration enforcement entities, which means that every family member, every aunt, every uncle, every cousin who might take in a child fleeing violence is now subject to ICE enforcement actions and potential deportation, which creates exactly the chilling effect Republicans want. Because if you're an undocumented parent living in the United States and your child is detained at the border, you now face an impossible choice between reuniting with your child and exposing yourself to deportation or leaving your child in indefinite federal detention. Let me hit you with another bombshell, because this gets even worse and reveals the absolutely Kafkaesque nightmare that the Trump administration has created for these children. Government sources say that for the last 6 weeks they've been ordered not to release undocumented children who cross the border alone to join their parents and relatives, and officially the Trump administration says it has not issued a moratorium on those releases. But around the country, attorneys say children aren't being released to sponsors, and a federal field specialist and ORR staff member whose job it is to sign off on releases said that in early November they were given a verbal order by their supervisor to halt all releases to sponsors, even those who had cleared the vetting process, and immigration attorneys across the country all said they're seeing the same thing, and this is not normal, which means we are watching in real time the creation of a shadow family separation policy that operates through bureaucratic obstruction rather than explicit executive order, so that when challenged in court, the administration can claim no such policy exists. And here's where we need to talk about the rhetoric in that clip, because Russell Fry is doing something extraordinarily manipulative when he talks about perverse incentives and smuggling, and he's deploying what political theorists call securitization discourse, which is when you frame a humanitarian issue as a security threat to justify extraordinary measures that would otherwise be unacceptable in a liberal democracy. When Fry says that the system creates a perverse incentive that encourages illegal alien parents to have their children smuggled across the border, he's suggesting that parents fleeing gang violence and poverty and political persecution in Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador are making calculated economic decisions to exploit American generosity rather than desperate survival decisions to save their children's lives. And this rhetorical move does two things simultaneously. It dehumanizes migrants by portraying them as rational actors gaming the system rather than human beings in crisis, and it reframes child protection as border security, which allows Republicans to justify increasingly punitive measures as child welfare interventions. But let's talk about the actual empirical reality of sponsor vetting, because Republicans are claiming that under the Biden administration, children were being released to sponsors without proper background checks, and while it's true that the Office of Refugee Resettlement has faced capacity challenges during surges in unaccompanied minor arrivals, the characterization that children were systematically placed with criminals and traffickers is vastly overstated. All sponsors must pass a background check, and sponsors are adults who are suitable to provide for the child's physical and mental well-being and have not engaged in any activity that would indicate a potential risk to the child, and all sponsors must pass a background check. And while there have been cases of exploitation and abuse which are horrific and demand accountability, the vast majority of sponsors are family members seeking to reunite with children and provide them safety and stability, but Republicans need you to believe that the system is fundamentally broken and enabling mass trafficking because that justifies their actual goal, which is deterrence through cruelty. Now we need to examine what Fry means when he says UACs should not be placed with sponsors who have no immigration permanence because their caregiver may be deported at any moment, and he frames this as concern for creating stable environments for children, which sounds compassionate until you realize what he's actually proposing is that children should remain in federal detention indefinitely rather than being placed with their own parents if those parents are undocumented. Think about the perverse logic here, because Fry is arguing that a child is better off in a government facility separated from family than living with their mother or father who happens to lack legal immigration status. This reveals the core ideological commitment animating Republican immigration policy, which is that family separation is not a bug but a feature, because the goal is not child welfare, but immigration enforcement, and the children are simply collateral damage in a broader project of demographic control and nativist exclusion. ICE launched an initiative with state and local law enforcement 287-gram partners aimed at protecting 450,000 Guan partners, aimed at 1,000 unaccompanied children illegally smuggled over the border and placed with unvetted sponsors under the Biden administration, and Secretary Noem is leading efforts to rescue and stop the exploitation of the 450,000 Guan partners. 1,000 unaccompanied children the Biden administration lost or placed with unvetted sponsors, and many of the children who came across the border unaccompanied were allowed to be placed with sponsors who were smugglers and sex traffickers, except this framing is based on a fundamental misrepresentation of data, because Homan has claimed that more than 300,000 children had been given to unvetted sponsors, which is a claim previously made by then Vice Presidential candidate J.D. Vance and congressional Republicans, but advocates and Democrats say there's no evidence the claim is true, and the figure comes from a DHS report that said nearly 300,000 unaccompanied migrant children had not received their notice to come to court, and 32,000 had missed a court hearing between October 2018 and September 2023. And immigration rights advocates argue there are several reasons, including that removal proceedings may not have begun or court papers were sent to wrong addresses. So let's be absolutely clear about what missing means in this context, because Republicans want you to imagine 300,000 children who have disappeared into trafficking networks, when the reality is that the reports of large numbers of missing UACs are inaccurate and overblown, and these missing UACs are based solely on their failure to appear for their immigration court hearings, or the failure of ICE to issue a notice to appear for a court hearing. And while the vast majority of the UACs missing court hearings or not receiving an NTA are in fact safe with sponsors, the OIG report was correct in highlighting shortcomings in the system, which means yes, there are legitimate concerns about post-placement monitoring, and yes, the system should be improved to ensure child safety, but the Republican characterization that hundreds of thousands of children have been lost or trafficked is fear-mongering propaganda designed to manufacture consent for draconian enforcement measures. And here's where I want you to sit with the profound moral obscenity of what's happening, because on March 21, 2025, a near-total termination of legal services for the UAC program was issued by the Trump administration, in effect stopping legal representation for unaccompanied children trying to navigate our judiciary system without a parent or guardian, and while there is a concerted effort to have the funding for the program reinstated, the outcome of this ongoing dispute is uncertain, as the Trump administration takes additional steps to significantly limit legal services for unaccompanied children, which means the administration is simultaneously claiming to protect children while denying them legal representation in immigration proceedings and holding them indefinitely in federal custody and targeting their potential sponsors for deportation. And if you can't see that this is a system designed to terrorize and deter rather than protect, then you're not paying attention to the structural violence being enacted. When Fry says Democrats claim this bill will cause family separation, he's engaging in what we call projection, because mass deportation is family separation by another name, and it's not ripping away children from their parents at the border, but it is taking parents away from children in their homes and at their schools and in the interior of the country, and that's exactly what's happening under the enforcement policies that Republicans are championing right now. The Kayla Hamilton Act, which passed with a 225-100 vote with support from all voting Republicans and just 7 Democrats breaking with their party to support the Republican-led bill, creates a framework where children are detained, longer sponsors are surveilled more extensively, families are separated more frequently, and the entire apparatus of child welfare is subordinated to the imperatives of immigration enforcement. Think about what it means that the Trump administration has added new vetting requirements for sponsors like DNA testing for family members and fingerprinting all the adults in the household where the kid's going to be living. But the Administration of Children and Families, which oversees ORR, said the office has not issued a moratorium on sponsor releases, yet they did not explain why most releases have just stopped cold, and the attorneys spoke with said this hold on releases has really been taking a toll on kids, and all this pressure, the drawn-out vetting process, and being told you're not going to leave federal custody anytime soon, and we don't know why, is making some kids reconsider whether it's worth trying to stay in the U.S., and the attorneys told me that more and more of these kids are deciding it's not worth it, and instead they're just choosing to leave the country, which is of course exactly the outcome Republicans want, because the goal has never been child protection. The goal is deterrence, and the children are simply instruments of policy rather than human beings with rights and dignity. We need to understand this in the broader historical context of how the right has consistently weaponized concerns about child welfare to advance reactionary political projects, and this is not a new phenomenon. This is a recurring tactic that we see from opposition to sex education, framed as protecting children from grooming, to opposition to LGBTQ rights, framed as protecting children from ideology, to opposition to reproductive rights, framed as protecting unborn children, and in every case the actual well-being of children is subordinated to a broader ideological agenda that centers control and punishment and exclusion. The same politicians who claim to be protecting unaccompanied minors from trafficking are the ones who oppose comprehensive sex education and oppose funding for child protective services and oppose universal health care and oppose expanding the child tax credit and oppose gun control, even as children are massacred in schools, and the hypocrisy is so glaring that it would be laughable if it weren't so deadly. What Russell Fry is doing in that clip is constructing what Giorgio Agamben would call a state of exception, where normal legal protections are suspended in the name of emergency. And the emergency in this case is the supposed crisis of child smuggling and trafficking, which requires extraordinary measures like indefinite detention and mass surveillance and family separation to address. But the state of exception is never temporary. It becomes normalized. It becomes the new baseline for how we treat the most vulnerable populations, and that's exactly what we're seeing with the systematic dismantling of protections for unaccompanied minors under the guise of child safety. When the systematic dismantling of protections for unaccompanied minors under the guise of child safety. Republicans talk about common sense reforms. What they mean is the expansion of detention, the criminalization of sponsors, the elimination of due process protections, and the creation of a permanent underclass of people whose very existence is rendered illegal and whose children can be detained indefinitely without recourse. And I want you to notice the language Fry uses when he talks about illegal alien parents having their children smuggled, as if the parents are the perpetrators, rather than people making impossible choices under conditions of violence and poverty and state collapse that the United States has directly contributed to through decades of interventionist foreign policy and support for authoritarian regimes and economic exploitation through trade agreements that devastate local economies. The entire framing erases agency from migrants and portrays them as either criminals smuggling children or children being smuggled but never as human beings, exercising the fundamental human right to seek asylum and safety for their families that is enshrined in international law going back to the 1951 Refugee Convention. Here's another bombshell for you, because we need to talk about what enhanced vetting actually means in practice. On March 25, 2025, the Office of Refugee Resettlement posted to the Federal Register an interim final rule reversing a 2024 Biden rule that prevented ORR from releasing immigration information about the sponsors of unaccompanied minors to any law enforcement or immigration enforcement entity at any time, and recent actions by ICE increasing immigration enforcement efforts against certain UACs and their sponsors and potentially limiting the UAC sponsor pool to blood relatives come with clear downsides, and these efforts appear to be motivated, at least in part by recent reporting, that some 300,000 UACs are missing when they simply fail to show up to a hearing or are not served paperwork, making these recent Trump administration actions appear to be based on a false premise or simply intended to ramp up arrest, which means the entire apparatus of enhanced vetting is not about child safety, it's about creating a database of undocumented people that can be fed directly to ICE for deportation purposes. Think about the chilling effect this creates, because if you're a grandmother living in Houston and your grandson crosses the border fleeing violence in Honduras, you now have to choose between claiming him and subjecting yourself and everyone in your household to fingerprinting and background checks and immigration status verification that will be shared with ICE, or leaving him in federal detentions indefinitely. And this is not hypothetical. This is the lived reality for thousands of families right now. And the cruelty is not incidental. It is the mechanism through which deterrence operates. Republicans are banking on the fact that if they make the process sufficiently punitive and invasive, dangerous, then fewer people will come, and fewer sponsors will come forward, and more children will remain in detention, and the system will collapse under its own weight, which can then be used to justify even more draconian measures. In identifying flight risks, the memo highlighted UACs who were issued deportation orders after missing court appearances, or those with non-blood relative sponsors, and although failing to attend court appearances or the lack of family ties may be factors indicating flight risk in the adult criminal justice context, it is questionable whether they are similarly relevant for minor children who are dependent on a sponsor to help them with appearing for an immigration court hearing. And the February 23 ICE memo also creates new vetting requirements of UAC sponsors that, while possibly helping identify and ruling out some unsuitable prospective sponsors, would almost certainly discourage a larger number of qualified sponsors from caring for UACs, which reveals that the stated purpose and the actual effect of these policies are completely at odds, because while Republicans claim to be protecting children from unsafe placements, they are actually making it harder for children to be placed safely with family members and instead forcing them into prolonged detention, which has a demonstrated strong adverse effect on mental health in minors. We also need to talk about who benefit from this system and follow the money, because the private prison industry and private detention facility operators make enormous profits from detaining migrants, including children, and the longer children remain in federal custody, the more revenue these private contractors generate, and many of these private companies are major donors to Republican political campaigns. And this is not conspiracy theory, this is the banal reality of how carceral capitalism operates in the United States, where human suffering is converted into shareholder value, and where the cruelty is not just the point, but also the profit model. Every child held in detention is a revenue stream, every family separated is a billable service, every deportation is a contract fulfilled, and the entire apparatus is designed to expand continuously, because there are powerful economic interests that benefit from the perpetual crisis at the border. When Fry talks about the last administration releasing UACs to sponsors before background checks were finalized, he's referring to the Biden administration's attempt to balance child welfare best practices, which recommend releasing children from detention as quickly as possible to minimize trauma, with the need for thorough vetting. And yes, there were capacity challenges during surges in arrivals, and yes, the system has been chronically underfunded by Congress, which Republicans control, and yes, there have been cases where children were placed in unsafe situations, and those cases are tragic, demand accountability, but the solution is not to stop releasing children altogether and keep them in indefinite detention. The solution is to properly fund the Office of Refugee Resettlement and provide adequate resources for vetting and post-placement monitoring, and ensure that children have legal representation and that sponsors have support services. But Republicans don't want solutions, they want crises, because crises justify emergency powers, and emergency powers allow them to implement their broader anti-immigrant agenda without democratic deliberation or oversight. And I need you to understand the profound trauma that detention inflicts on children, because we have extensive research showing that even short periods of detention cause lasting psychological harm, including anxiety, depression, PTSD, and developmental delays. And when you combine detention with separation from family, and the uncertainty about their future, and the conditions in many detention facilities which are often overcrowded and under-resourced, you are talking about state-sponsored child abuse, and that is not hyperbole, that is the clinical assessment of pediatricians and child psychologists who have studied these facilities and interviewed these children. The documentary Separated is a searing exploration of the first Trump administration's zero-tolerance immigration policy at the U.S.-Mexico border, which forcibly separated over 5,000 migrant children from their families who illegally entered the country. One of the things that so often gets lost in conversations about Trump's family separation policy is that harm to children was the point, and it was the point. And based on first-hand interviews with civil servants who tried to stand up and stop the policy and help the policy reversal, we know what they wanted to do, and they wanted to hurt kids in order to scare other families from coming to this country and scare Congress into enacting more restrictive immigration laws, and it's exactly the way that they drew it up and exactly what they wanted to do. That is the moral reality we are dealing with here, because the cruelty is not an unfortunate side effect, it is the intended mechanism of deterrence. And when Republicans claim they are protecting children, what they are actually doing is using children as weapons in a broader war against immigration. And the fact that some Democrats voted for the Kayla Hamilton Act shows how effective the right has been at shifting the Overton window on immigration policy, to the point where even progressives feel compelled to support punitive measures out of fear of being labeled soft on border security. Congressman Jared Golden of Maine was one of just 7 Democrats to break with their party to support the Republican-led bill, and while I understand the political pressure he's facing in a purple district, this is exactly how rights are eroded incrementally through compromise and triangulation, until what was once considered unconscionable becomes normalized and accepted. The reference to the Kayla Hamilton case is particularly cynical, because while that murder was absolutely tragic and preventable, Republicans are using an individual case to justify systemic changes that will affect hundreds of thousands of children, and this is textbook moral panic construction, where you take an extreme outlier case, present it as representative of a broader pattern to justify sweeping policy changes, and it's the same tactic used to justify three-strikes laws and sex offender registries, and the war on drugs, and in every case the policies enacted in response cause far more harm than they prevent, because they are animated by retribution and control, rather than evidence and care. The legislation is named in honor of Kayla Hamilton, a young woman who was sexually assaulted and brutally murdered by a 17-year-old MS-13 gang member, and UAC who illegally entered the country through the southern border and was released by the Biden administration to a sponsor. And yes, that is horrific. And yes, the vetting process failed in that case, but the solution is to improve vetting, not to keep thousands of children in detention indefinitely, or to prevent undocumented family members from serving as sponsors. We also need to talk about the bipartisan failure to address the root causes of migration, because the reason children are coming to the United States unaccompanied is not because the sponsor system is too lenient, it's because conditions in Central America have become so intolerable, due to violence and poverty and climate change, that parents are making the desperate calculation that their children have a better chance of surviving if they flee alone than if they stay, and the United States bears significant responsibility for those conditions through our support for military coups and death squads during the Cold War, and our drug war, policies that have empowered cartels, and our trade policies that have destroyed local economies, and our climate emissions that have made subsistence agriculture impossible in many regions. If we actually wanted to reduce unaccompanied minor arrivals, we would invest in addressing those root causes through development aid and violence prevention and climate adaptation, but that would require acknowledging our complicity, and Republicans would rather build walls and detention centers and blame migrants for seeking the safety and opportunity that we take for granted. When Fry says we should not be complicit in the smuggling of children into this country, he's erasing the difference between human smuggling and human trafficking, because smuggling involves facilitating unauthorized border crossing, usually at the request of the person being smuggled, while trafficking involves coercion and exploitation, and the vast majority of families are paying smugglers, not traffickers, to help their children reach safety because the legal pathways for asylum have been systematically closed off by restrictive policies and metering at ports of entry and third-country transit bans and Title 42 expulsions. If we actually wanted to stop smuggling, we would expand legal pathways for asylum so that families didn't have to resort to dangerous irregular migration, but Republicans don't want to expand legal pathways. They want to close all pathways because the goal is not orderly migration, but zero migration, and the rhetoric about child smuggling is simply a more palatable way to sell that exclusionary agenda to the public. Here's what's at stake and why this matters beyond the immediate humanitarian crisis, because the normalization of child detention and family separation and indefinite bureaucratic obstruction of family reunification represents a fundamental assault on human rights and the rule of law, and if we allow these policies to become permanent fixtures of our immigration system, then we have abandoned any pretense of being a nation that values human dignity and due process. The Trump administration is conducting a massive experiment in bureaucratic cruelty right now, testing how much suffering they can inflict through administrative action without explicit executive orders, so that when challenged in court, they can claim plausible deniability and the fact that children are being held indefinitely without explanation, while the Administration of Children and Families, which oversees ORR, sent an email saying the office has not issued a moratorium on sponsor releases, and they referred to enhanced vetting policies, but they did not explain why most releases have just stopped cold, is exactly the kind of Kafkaesque nightmare that authoritarian regimes specialize in, where the machinery of oppression operates through absence and silence and bureaucratic paralysis, rather than through explicit commands that can be challenged in court. And I want to close by talking about what resistance looks like, because it's not enough to be outraged by this. We need to understand that under a settlement between the Biden administration and the ACLU, the federal government will not be able to reintroduce a family separation policy for a period of 8 years, which means there are legal constraints on what the Trump administration can do explicitly, but they are clearly attempting to circumvent those constraints through bureaucratic obstruction, and the question is whether courts and civil society organizations and the press will hold them accountable. We need immigration attorneys filing habeas corpus petitions for every child being held beyond the legal timeline. We need investigative journalists exposing the gap between official policy and actual practice. We need Congress members demanding answers and holding hearings, and we need mass mobilization, demanding that children be released to vetted sponsors, and that families be kept together, and that we stop using the most vulnerable populations as pawns in political games. This is a 5-alarm fire for anyone who cares about human rights, and the fact that it's happening through bureaucratic means rather than dramatic executive orders doesn't make it any less urgent or any less cruel, and the fact that Republicans are wrapping it in the language of child protection doesn't make it any less of a moral obscenity. We are watching the construction of a system designed to inflict maximum suffering as a deterrent, and the children are not incidental casualties. They are the primary targets because Republicans have calculated that Americans will tolerate any amount of cruelty toward immigrant children if it's framed as necessary for border security and public safety. Our job is to prove them wrong by demanding accountability and justice, and an end to the systematic abuse of children in the name of immigration enforcement, because that is the baseline of human decency, and we will not accept anything less.